Welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today we're diving into early American history and the remarkable friendship between two of our nation's founders, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. My guest is Louis Major, Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of American Studies and History at Rutgers University, and an accomplished cultural historian. This latest book, A Journey North, Jefferson, Madison, and the Forging of a Friendship, takes us back to the spring of 1791 when Jefferson and Madison traveled together through upstate New York and New England. This horseback journey came at a pivotal moment for the young republic, and it not only shaped politics but cemented one of the most important friendships in American history. Lewis has written widely on American culture, politics, and history, covering everything from Lincoln and the Civil War to Bruce Springsteen and baseball. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and Slate. Lewis, welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here with you.
It's great to have you here. So, what first inspired you to write about this 1791 journey taken by Jefferson and Madison?
Well, you were kind enough to mention the scope of my work. One of the things that unifies my interests is I approach history as the kind of world in a grain of sand. I like to find discrete moments or texts and sort of write about them. So I wrote about Lincoln's last speech, and I wrote about the First World Series, and I wrote about a record album, Springsteen's Born to Run. And at some point, I became aware of this journey that the two of them took, and I began to research it. Not much had been written about it. And truth be told, this is also a kind of pandemic book. You know, we were sort of locked in. There wasn't places to go, but it turns out there's something called the Founders Archive, which has all of the correspondence of the founding fathers online. And so the research that I needed to do for this book was sort of readily available to me in 2020, 2021, when you really couldn't go into archives and you really couldn't get out there. And so the combination of this kind of discrete moment that I could write about and unpack and looking for something to do when I couldn't get to the archives just came together and gelled in writing this book.
This trip came at a critical point for the new republic. What were the political tensions at the time, and why was this journey significant in that context?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the journey occurs right on the heels of nothing less than the formation of the first political party system in America. The idea of Federalists versus Democratic Republicans had just exploded, particularly over the debate between Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton over Hamilton's plans for Treasury, his funding and assumption plans. It was in June of 1790, less than a year before, that they had the famous dinner meeting, so immortalized in the play Hamilton, where they made a deal that Hamilton's fiscal plans would pass in return for moving the capital to the banks of the Potomac. In the intervening year, it was nothing but partisan politics at an extreme that had never been known and which they dreaded. We have to recall, I mean, we're so used to partisan politics these days that it's hard to believe there was a time when there wasn't any, or when the founding fathers despaired the idea that there might be. Jefferson famously said, if I have to go to heaven but with party, I would never go there at all. And yet he stood at the creation of this really vicious vituperative party system. And I think by the time we get to the spring of 1791, May 21st is when they leave, both of them were looking for some release, some escape, some way to get away from. Now, you may want to talk about this more. I won't go on and on about it, but there's some question as to why did they take the trip in the first place? And the political opponents who we're referring to, they were skeptical. They saw conspiracy all over the place. What are these two Democratic Republican leaders doing marching up through what was essentially Federalist territory? Were they up to no good? It turns out they weren't, but that didn't stop Federalists from thinking that way.
Yeah, they were venturing deep into Federalist New England. What do we know about how they were received on this northern journey?
So There isn't much because, unlike George Washington, who as president traveled the country and everyone knew he was coming, they just did this more or less as two anonymous citizens. Although every now and again, newspapers got wind of the fact that the Secretary of State and this distinguished uh, friend James Madison were traveling around, and what we have is some Democratic Republican newspapers, then as now, they parsed based on their political leanings, praise these two for trying to get the feel of the landscape and trying to experience the lives of the people. There were others who were far more skeptical and wrote, in some cases, letters, kind of nasty letters, suggesting what it is that the two of them were up to. There was one letter that one correspondent wrote to Hamilton, in which he reported on the trip, and he says that at dinner, all of the Federalists gathered. They ridiculed Jefferson and Madison's tour, in which they scouted silently through the country, shunning the gentry, because, of course, they represent the working people, communing and pitying with the Shayshites, a reference to the rebels from 1787, and quarreling with the eatables. Nothing is good enough for them. So the journey was parsed based on one's own politics to begin with, but by and large, there isn't much reportage about what it is that they're doing.
I want to talk about their friendship. I was recently in Charlottesville, Virginia, at Jefferson's home in Monticello, and I remember being on the tour and standing next to his bed and thinking about, and this has been much written about now, Adams and Jefferson's relationship and the day they died. I just standing there thinking about the two of them on that day and what was going through their minds in that beautiful house in Charlottesville. Madison and Jefferson, how did this trip help solidify their personal friendship beyond the political alliance that they already shared?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that because I don't want people to mistake the argument. I'm not arguing that it began their friendship. Their friendship began in 1776. They met while working in the Virginia Assembly. Jefferson is older than Madison. He's taller than Madison, and by a great deal. And so Madison, in effect, looked up to Jefferson in more ways than one. I mean, here, the author of the Declaration of Independence, working with him in the Virginia Assembly. And then, some years later in 1784, 1783, they were together in Philadelphia. And here their friendship continued to blossom. They bonded over books, they bonded over the shared kind of intellectual interests. Jefferson convinced Madison to buy a thermometer because he thought it was very important to keep track of the weather. And Jefferson famously has volume after volume after volume of his weather books. So there's a friendship, in fact, so much so that Jefferson tried to get Madison to buy property near him in Charlottesville and to move there. He in effect became his real estate agent. But um, but so the friendship is there. Jefferson, of course, is in France from 1784 to 1789. So what we have is a correspondence between them. Thank goodness we have that because it's one of their correspondence is absolutely amazing, and it's also one of the sources for this book, in which they talk about the Constitution and Jefferson talks about wanting a Bill of Rights. But my argument about the trip is that it deepened their friendship. It helped forge a friendship that took it to another level. It took it to a level where the personal and the political intermingled in ways that would never again be inseparable. And the reason why I know this and why I can in effect prove it is because at the end of their lives, they both recalled making this trip together. Now, this is more than 30 years later. They each had occasion to talk about and write about this trip and the way in which any of us who've ever been on a road trip with a sibling or a friend knows that there's something about those road trips that creates a bond that's very different than just kind of going out for dinner or taking a walk. I think that that's the power that this trip had and held over them for the rest of their lives.
Lewis, you write also that Madison later recalled they became immediate companions. Were there some moments or experiences on this journey that deepened their bond?
I think it's just the traveling together. I think it's the the in and out of being on the road, of sharing experiences. This was a trip that they took not as politicians. This is a trip that they took as naturalists, as tourists. I mean, the capacity of their interests that they shared in botany, in entomology, in anthropology, and each kept journals for a little bit of time. So I don't think it was any one specific moment per se, but it was being together, talking to one another, sharing these experiences that I elaborate on in the book of the different things that interested them, and that was one of the sources for them going along, and that brought them closer together.
Yeah, you mentioned they were talking about it 30 years later. At the end of his life, Jefferson said his friendship with Madison had been a source of constant happiness. What can we learn about friendship, leadership, and loyalty from their relationship today?
I love that question, and I have to think about it because I've thought about it. I thought about it a lot. I think the friendship feeds and fuels and underscores the work that they do. And I think you can't understand the work that they do. In their case, the political work, uh, profound and important political work as presidents and as secretaries of states, and in a variety of other capacities. I think that friendship really helps promote some of the creativity that they had as politicians. And that may sound strange. Like how can friendship do that? And maybe right now my thing about this is overly influenced by a book I just read that your listeners are going to think, wow, that's a stretch. But again, you've already warned everyone that I have breadth in my interest. I just read this book about John Lennon and Paul McCartney, called A Love Story in Songs. And it's a book that really shows how that friendship fueled their creativity and how we wouldn't have the creativity of their songwriting without this closeness, this connection. I think the same can be said about Jefferson and Madison. They were friends for 50 years. John Quincy Adams called theirs the most important political friendship that America has ever seen at one of the anniversaries. There are ways in which that level of comfort, that sharing and combining and experiencing together just was indispensable. And it's a good question in general about friendship because we tend not to think about that. We think about public lives, not about private lives. But here it's critical to understand, I think, the connections and the relationships between the two.
You've written about figures like Lincoln, pivotal years like 1831, even rock music, as mentioned earlier. How did writing A Journey North compare to your other projects?
That's a terrific question. In some ways, what unifies them is my interest in narrative nonfiction. I've always been, I'm a professional historian, I'm a scholar, but I'm not a scholar who's interested in writing for an audience of three people or for making historiographic arguments. Instead, it's about how do you tell this story? And figuring that out is part of the joy that I have of sitting down every day at the computer. I mean, no two of my books are the same way, but and this was a challenge because we don't have a lot of evidence. We don't have a lot of sources. My Lincoln book, I was inundated with sources. So I even open up the preface by saying that this is a short book about a brief journey. So it's organized not necessarily chronologically, but loosely chronologically. And figuring out the structure was an important part of writing the book. And in this case, it's structured by these four episodes that occur that are pivotal to understanding what it is they did and what it is they discovered along the trip.
If you could join Jefferson and Madison on one leg of the 1791 journey, where would you go and why?
It's such an interesting trip. As I write about in the book, there was a thing called the Hessian fly that Jefferson spent a lot of time trying to take notes on. It was devastating wheat crops. And of course, Jefferson and Madison and Washington, they're all farmers and they care about this. There's a moment where he encounters Native Americans, members of the Uncochag tribe, and he writes down their vocabularies, and this promotes his interest in that. They spend time thinking about sugar maple trees when they're in Vermont. But if I had to pick one moment, it would be the moment when Madison and Jefferson encounter a free black farmer. And Madison writes a lengthy entry in his journal about that. And I use that to talk a lot about the complexities of these men who were slaveholders and their attitudes towards slavery. And it's important that I mention to your listeners that there was someone else along on this trip, James Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's enslaved chef and servant. We know that he was there, and yet, like in so much of history, he remains invisible. The only reason I know is because Jefferson has a note in which he sent James Hemings ahead with some of their supplies when they first left the trip. So this moment for me that I would like to have witnessed and even discussed with them is what do you make of this guy? And why seeing this free black man farming his own land in New York doesn't force you to rethink some of your own assumptions about slavery.
Yeah. What do you hope readers will take away from this story about America's early years and about the power of friendship in shaping history?
Yeah, I think a few things. I mean, number one, I think I feel it's hard to find topics on Jefferson and Madison that haven't been covered. And to that extent, I'm delighted that I did find one. I want people to think about Jefferson and Madison as something other than just political figures. They are classically educated Enlightenment figures who devour and absorb all kinds of things that they encounter. And I think that knowing that sheds a slightly different light on just the political discourse. And as we've already talked about, Steve, I think the friendship is absolutely critical and beautiful to
Mm.
behold. Um, I want people to appreciate this friendship, to think about them in that way, and perhaps lead them to reflect in their own lives on their own friendships and the value of those friendships and how it adds and what it brings to their lives.
What's one book on early American history, Lewis, you think everyone should read besides yours?
Well, I don't necessarily think everybody should read my book on early American history. Uh, I'm going to hedge this by referring to not a work of scholarship by a historian, but a primary source. I think everyone should read Ben Franklin's autobiography.
Mm.
I think Ben Franklin's autobiography is one of the great texts. I've taught it for some 30 odd years. I edited an edition of it. If we're going to talk about the American dream and how-to books and one of the most pivotal figures in American history, Franklin's a good one. And I think his autobiography certainly repays visiting. If you're going to press me to pick a work of history, you know, I enjoy, of course, Ron Chernow's Hamilton, and I enjoy some of Joseph Ellis's books on Revolutionary Brothers. And fortunately, we don't want for great literature about the era of the American Revolution.
Yes. What is next for you in your writing?
It's a great question. I think I'm actually going to talking about Lennon and McCartney. I think I'm moving back toward finishing up something that I had started earlier in the realm of rock and roll. Again, keeping with my theme of the world in the grain of sand. I have a lecture slash show I wrote about 10 songs that shaped rock and roll and changed American culture. And I'm writing a book about those 10 songs, and hopefully you'll have me back and we can sort
Yes.
of talk about the songs I picked and the songs that I left off. And then God willing, I also have some ideas. You know, I love Lincoln more than anyone else. I've written two Lincoln books and a book on the Civil War, and so I'm always sort of being pulled back by the aura of Abraham Lincoln.
Well, this old classic rock DJ will be definitely interested in that book.
Is
So,
that right? I didn't
yeah,
know
I'm
that.
actually still on the air now. Yes, that's my day job. Yes.
No kidding. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. What
Yeah. So,
should we keep talking about that,
yeah,
or is that too much?
sure. No, sure.
Because you know I love thinking about playlists. You know, I
Yes.
actually when I wrote my Civil War book, I created a Civil War playlist, songs that name check the Civil War. But yeah, I'm dealing with you know from Elvis Presley to Bruce Springsteen, sort of 10 songs, and so it's it's Johnny B. Good, Chuck Berry, and it's
Yeah.
Rolling Stone Satisfaction,
Oh,
and
that's
it's
my band. That's the Stones and Zeppelin are my top two. So,
fantastic.
but no, we
Fantastic.
will talk again. Definitely. He is Louis Masur. The website is louismasur.com, Masur. Louis Masur, all one word. And this book out now that you can enjoy is great. A Journey North, Jefferson, Madison, and the Forging of a Friendship. It's a fascinating look at the road trip that helped forge not only a political partnership, but a lifelong bond between two of our nation's founders. You can get this book wherever books are sold. Louis, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Steve. This has been great.
Thank you. And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Thanks for watching. Like it, share it, subscribe to it, write a review. We will talk to you again next time.